If you engage Putin in diplomatic relations and you make a treaty with him, almost as soon as the ink has dried, he's invading you. Well, that means any treaty of peace that you undertake with somebody like Putin is actually just the end of the first stage, leading to the next stage, which will be war.
Hello. In 416 BC, during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the island of Melos was a non-combatant. Strategically located in the middle of the Aegean Sea, the Athenians arrived and demanded Melos surrender and thus be absorbed into their empire. The Melians refused, and so one of the most famous and influential passages in Thucydides' history was recounted by the delegates of Athens. The strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. We are returning to an era of empires asserting their dominance, and so joining to discuss Ukraine and its implications for Europe is historian and writer Philip Blood, author of Putin's War, as we discuss Ukraine over the past 3 years and what can be done for the future. And, as a little Easter egg at the end, historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop joins with her thoughts on the war in Ukraine as she launches a new podcast with Ian Dale. Coming up on the pod, we have a Vietnam War special, Hadrian's Wall, Helen Lederer talks about her family in World War II, and plenty more. So please do subscribe, follow, and share with family and friends. But until then, it's me talking with Philip Blood on Putin's War. Philip, welcome back to the podcast. Very great pleasure to have you on.
Great to see you, Ollie. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Well, this is far too late for that because this will be going out in March. But for the sake of the listeners, Philip is usually discussing the Second World War, but we're going a little bit more contemporary because the war in Ukraine is no doubt historic, therefore counts under the rather wide parameters of aspects of history. So, Philip, we're talking about your book that was published just over a year now, actually, Putin's War, Russian Genocide. So that should leave the listeners in little doubt as to your position on this. But I wondered, this is a collection of essays. So you've edited this, put it together. And I wondered if you could just sort of explain a little bit of the genesis of the book, why it came about, and really what the thinking was behind you and your colleagues who've worked on it.
The start point would be when I was invited to write the book in April. There'd been a lot going on. I don't know if you recall those days back in 2022. There were all kinds of attitudes as to whether this was going to be a long war, a short war, Russia was going to win, Ukraine was going to lose, all the rest of it. And we were already, and that when I say we, my friends in Fallout, the webpage group of Ben Skipper, myself, and Dustin DeCane, were already committed to discussing the war from a slightly different angle to what had been said. And just to give you an idea, there were people like, and some of them are quite famous names now, like Phillips O'Brien was saying in April 22, the Russian army is running out of options. And that same month, Lawrence Friedman,
he's been on the podcast.
Yeah. Putin is a hurry to end the war. Jack Watling from Royal United Services Institute, the death rows of imperial delusion. And we had Mark Urban,
also a friend of the podcast.
The heavy losses in an elite Russian regiment. Now, if you look at my gang, so to speak, I straight away in February said, at the very end of February, said Russia has created an anaconda plan, structure of operations around Ukraine, locking them in. March 22, I was saying it's going to be a long war. And February, with Bucha and similar incidences, and what the Russian press media was saying, I was already talking about genocide. And at the end of March, I was saying we're looking at new colonialism. So in a sense, you've got the experts looking at this war from some form of traditional NATO perspective. And myself and colleagues were already looking at this war in a very different way.
You mentioned an Anaconda War. I don't
Well,
know what that is.
the Anaconda Plan, it stems from the days when General Winfield Scott, during the American Civil War, created the Anaconda Plan, which was to crush the Confederacy so it could never escape. So you blockade, you shut it down, and then you basically restrict its activities internally and overseas so it can't really do much. And eventually you crush it to death, which is basically what happened to the Confederacy during the American Civil War. What I was looking at was the Anaconda here is going for a much longer process because what they needed to do was to seal up Ukraine and force it into a situation where it can't really commit to strategic operations. And I say that because during this period, I was in quite a lot of contact with chaps in Eastern Europe and places like Estonia, where they were working in the military academies, and they were saying to me, you know, Ukraine isn't thinking strategically; they're working completely operationally and making kind of strategic errors. And I don't know if you remember when we were talking previously on a podcast, I mentioned something called the defender's dilemma, which is you get a situation where do you attack and where do you defend and how. And I was increasingly saying through 2022 and into 2023 that Ukraine is running towards the defender's dilemma. Loads of people were saying it's not true, blah, blah, blah. I also said, and you know, we've got this shared experience of both having worked in the City of London. I knew that the blockades on Russia and the sanctions weren't working. It's never going to happen. If it didn't happen against South Africa, it's not going to happen against Russia. So I made myself exceedingly unpopular with an awful lot of people, especially those who are in the diplomatic service or those who are in NATO, because I was suggesting also that NATO, if it doesn't put an air security zone over Ukraine on day one, the chances of NATO being involved without serious major war is limited. And once Biden gave the unilateral decision that NATO wasn't going to be involved, I knew Ukraine was in a very difficult position, and the Anaconda Plan was then going to crush it even more. What followed, if you recall, was, and where I started to talk about mechanized genocide, was the fact that the Russian artillery was being targeted by square blocks. So they weren't using digital to be picked up by Ukrainian drones and NATO advanced equipment. They were literally almost carpet bombing by square of cities like Kiev and Mariupol and crushing the civilians under rubble and high explosive. And this was not collateral damage from artillery operations. This was directed literally by grid, working their way.
Targeting civilians.
Targeting civilian homes, civilian society, and literally crushing. So if you remember what Mariupol looked like after it had been occupied, I mean, the whole place looked utterly devastated. And that's what the Russians have been doing now for 4 years. So, of course, for myself and the colleagues, and I'll talk about the colleagues in a minute, when we decided to write this book, our thoughts were we must address not just what the establishment of military analysts are not addressing, but we need to look back at the history that's pushing what's happening. But more importantly, it seemed to me, as the editor setting publishing policy, I thought it was important that we recorded as much of the first year of the war as possible. Now, there's a reason for that. If you go back to 1939, we have a very vague idea of what really what was going on. We seem to go from Munich 1938 to September 1939, and we're at war, and everything that goes on between kind of gets forgotten, and academics read about it, but in popular history it kind of gets smoothed away. And it's similar with what's happened in recent wars. We tend to forget how the Vietnam War started, or we look at back on the War of Terror and we forget, and we assume, well, everything happened after 9/11. Well, yeah, that's not how things happened. Um, so my view was we take the first year of this invasion and this period, and in my case, looking back between 1945 and 2022, and crushing it into the process of what's happened in that first year. And to assist in that, I asked Roger Cirillo, who was a colonel in the US Army, who had served in the Fulda Gap during the Cold War and had been a senior staff officer in NATO and had worked for NATO commander Gordon Sullivan, who, funny enough, from my time when I worked with the US Army, he was the boss, and I'd been able to engage with Gordon Sullivan about stuff back in the day. So all my notes and contact with US generals from that period back in 2000 to 2010, I was able to draw on, because that gave me a different perspective of how the war on terror had been managed and handled, and how early American wars had been handled and managed. And then I could start thinking about how they were going to address this war. And so that was my input. Roger Cirillo wrote an excellent essay on the Cold War element. And then for me, the key was Chris Bellamy. Chris Bellamy is a Russianist of the best form. He'd studied with John Ericsson in Scotland to do his PhD. He had served in the British Army in the artillery. And he was my second boss to Richard Holmes when I was at the Royal Military College of Shrivenham doing my PhD. So Chris was both a mentor in a sense that he had been when I was doing my PhD, but also this brilliant knowledge of modern Russian arms going back from the Second World War right the way through. And in fact, he was still talking about, the way the Russians had approached matters in the 20s and 30s. So with Chris, we had this great wealth of inside knowledge of Russian and Soviet forces and the history of that fighting and the way they were going to be fighting this war. And he's pretty much on the ball how the Russians unraveled their strategic operations. And then my colleague from Fallout Group, Dustin DeCane, is a Polish lawyer. The advantage there is his family actually came from Lviv, which is in Ukraine now, but was Poland. And he was traveling there. So he was going to see what it was like on the ground. So we were getting that kind of information. But he's also a lawyer, an attorney. And because he works in human rights field, we had somebody who could look at what the Russians were doing, things like the Wagner Group and what have you, as the next input. So he had 2 essays. Chris Bellamy had 2 essays. I think I had 3. And we all contributed to the introduction, and we contributed to the reflections at the end. And I said we had to have reflections rather than conclusion, because the war's not over, and it won't be over for a long time.
So you mentioned a long war. Just for the benefit of the listeners, what's the current state of play on losses?
Well, there's huge numbers of losses. I mean, I've seen numbers now where they're suggesting the Russian casualties are up to 1.1 million and the Ukrainians are 500,000.
It's so difficult to find numbers that one can rely on because both sides are reluctant to give them out. Is that correct?
There's no reliance on any numbers, and I wouldn't trust any of them, whether they're Ukrainian and whether they are Russian or anybody else come to that.
And we're speaking on the 28th of February, just so listeners know that.
It's like all the situation with NATO equipment. It struck me it's very interesting. All this NATO equipment has been absorbed by the war, and it's had no material effect on the Russians whatsoever. we know that the Russians,
Apart from 1.2 million dead.
if it's true, and they're not 1.2 million dead, that's overall casualties. You don't
Okay.
know what the real numbers are.
But
Um,
it must be significant if they're bringing in North Koreans and
are
Chinese.
they? Or is that global war? See, are they doing it to bolster their forces or they're doing global war? I think, you see,
But if
this is,
they had plenty of troops, they wouldn't require North Korean troops, would they?
um, I don't go with that. I'm more of the opinion that these foreign troops, whether they're Chechens or whether they're Koreans, they're serving a role. The Syrians, there's others. It's they're serving a purpose, which is to give the Russians the impression of, and I don't particularly like using the word, a crusade against the Ukrainian quote Nazis. Which I think it's a nonsense, the claims, but there is aspects of the Russian operations and what's been going on for the last 10 years in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which you have to give more credence to what the Russians are doing to understand how the war's developing. The problem with, the great and the good is they've tended to say Ukraine's going to win, NATO weapons are perfect, NATO will win because Ukraine will win, and we're all going to be happy, and so forth. And clearly, on the 28th of February 2025, that's not the case. We've now moved into the fourth year of the war, and sadly, and I say this sadly, and I dearly mean it, I've been proved right. And there's nothing so horrible as thinking your worst nightmare could actually be correct. Because my argument was, and it was key to what was being said in the book, is it's not just genocide by mass destruction, it's genocide by removing and unhinging the population. With the number of refugees, especially here in Germany from Ukraine, and people in Britain don't really see it, but I can go onto Arkham Station pretty much any time of the day during 2022, 2023, and the foreign trains would be coming in, and young men were being picked up by the police. And they weren't drugs smugglers. They were young Ukrainians who were escaping from the war. And the German government was treating them correctly as refugees. And, proud of my state, it's done the right thing. So we've got huge numbers of women and children and young men who've escaped the war. The problem, and Dustin noticed this in 2022, almost within 2 months of the war progressing, that actually the Ukrainians were struggling to find decent manpower.
And it's desperate now, isn't it?
Well, this is where I've said all along, you can't beat Russia very easily when you're dealing with mass. Now, that might sound a contradiction to anybody who's read my book. It might be a contradiction because I've said one of the reasons Russia is doing this is because of declining population. What Putin has been doing since he came to power in 1999 is to try and get the states back to put Russia back into the same levels of the last populations. Now, when my great uncle visited Russia in 1961 on a special tour, he was being told, the population is about 150 million. Well, when you look at the way Russia is now, 100 million, it's not just the fact that Ukraine and all these other states have been removed. There's a serious decline in population. And to address that decline, which comes up in huge conversations and meetings and conferences in Putin's little world. And by the way, you can read all of what Putin does because his papers are released almost daily. So all of his speeches and everything he's saying. And if you track through some of those speeches, you'll see how much population is on his mind. So whereas I was talking about new colonialism, in a sense, capturing large swathes of Ukrainian territory, I was also suggesting that the reason why the children are being kidnapped is because there is a shortfall of children, because there's high levels of child deaths and sterile couples, couples who've got no children. So for Putin, he's got several dilemmas. And when you understand Putin's dilemmas, to a certain extent, you can confront him in a different way. Yeah. And I know that doesn't make me popular with the Applebaums and whoever's, because my perspective is if you understand what the Russians are doing and how they're performing and why they're performing and behaving the way they are, it's easier to confront them rather than trying to look at them through the eyes of the Ukrainians and fight them on a one-for-one basis. That's where I think we've all gone wrong in the West. And that's why I think we've made these terrible decisions. Like, for instance, Biden turned off the aid at a critical time, and we forget that. So I think it was, what was it, 60 days, 120 days? There was no...
Yes, was this in 2023?
2022, 2023, that's right. It was the beginning of the year. So it's not just Trump who's playing his game of not supporting Ukraine. Biden was very iffy. And if you talk about some of the ways they were supporting Ukraine, you got Happy Clappy Johnson going there doing his thing. That really wasn't very helpful. What you actually needed was a coherent and coordinated process of the whole of Europe, either as NATO or as a European army, which of course I've been pressing all along, to confront the Russian bear. And see, I'm not, how do I put this without sounding horrible? I'm not greatly a fantastic supporter of Ukraine, because the Ukraine hasn't been the most perfect democratic state in the last 10 years. Things have gone wrong. But by the same token, I am not supporting Russia, which has waged aggressive war since 1999. And, loads of people have tried to say, well, it's NATO forces moving east and it's NATO expanding all these territories. Well, part of that's true. But also you've got to take into the equation that Putin has been waging aggressive war in Georgia, in Chechnya. I mean, he actually leveled Grozny in Chechnya in 1999, just to show people what he could do. And the idea that you can you can win mass war as a small state, even with NATO technology, is mistaken. And I think where we stand now, we see the consequences of that.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. This is a contradiction that I've been interested in, actually, because you've mentioned a few historians at the beginning, and we had also on a few, well, Lawrence Freeman was one, but General Petraeus graced me with his presence on this podcast. 4-star general. He is the highest rank. Actually, no, I think we had a British 4-star, but I think an American 4-star does slightly outweigh a British 4-star. And he was saying that militarily, it's very difficult, almost impossible for the Ukrainians to recover the Donbass and Crimea. And so with that in mind, surely we would always have arrived at peace talks. It was a matter of at what point do the various interested parties conclude that that's what needs to happen? So you have to lose a lot of people before you get to that state of thinking.
Well, here's the problem. And again, this is where we're still burrowing down towards the defender's dilemma. If you engage Putin in diplomatic relations and you make a treaty with him, almost as soon as the ink has dried, he's invading you. Right? Well, that means any treaty of peace that you undertake with somebody like Putin is actually just the end of the first stage, leading to the next stage, which will be war. So again, I was pressing, and I've said this in many places on podcasts and talks and what have you, that you can't negotiate with Putin. Now, okay, Trump thinks he can do a deal, and under the new colonialism, which now Trump is expressing, he can force Zelensky's hand by drawing on a country that's already devastated and stealing all their resources, which I think is a disgraceful thing.
Is the theory here that Philip, he would? This is the theory. I'm not a proponent of it. I don't know enough about it, of course, but the theory being that with American engineers, workmen, blah blah blah, on the ground in Ukraine exploiting the minerals within their country, that provides a level of security. That.
Can I tell you who uses a similar argument? The Wagner Group in Africa, protecting Africans when they're extracting mineral ores. I don't believe it for a second. The problem when you do that is what happened in Iraq when American corporates were extracting oil resources using private armies. And people don't know that because they don't read it. They don't study it. They're not interested in it. The American army wasn't defending the oil fields. It was corporate warriors that were defending the oil fields.
This was sort of, aspects of history lawyers will be asking me to use the word allegedly. Companies like Halliburton, allegedly, and was that not Black Rock, but Black something or other, allegedly.
Well, I'm not going to mention any names, but that was the content that was being spilled out. And you see, when that war was taking place, social media really wasn't the thing it is now. So to a certain extent, a lot of people who are tweeting about war and conflict and violence and genocide and everything else, they're a product of post-2006 war making. They missed all the juicy bits when there was violence and airplanes flying into buildings and all that horror that was going on that caused certain things to happen. What they've forgotten is that large corporations, as they have done always in the past, have recruited mercenaries and private armies to do fighting for them when they're in extraction areas, which is why the Wagner Group extracts from Africa, as do the Chinese. So the idea that extraction is going to save Ukraine, I can't go ahead with. It's just another form of
I see. So you're saying that, okay, don't let me put words in your mouth, but are you saying then that, okay, maybe the engineers' presence will mean that there won't be Russian military troops on the ground, but you're still seeing neo-colonialism because you are seeing resources being extracted by the Americans and they're effectively, annexing Ukraine?
Yeah, for their own interests. And then once they're wiped out, how does Ukraine pay its debts? I mean, this whole scenario is utter madness, because nowhere in this agreement that Ukraine would receive weapons and arms and military credits from the United States was there, in anything that I've come across, some idea of a major repayment. I mean, obviously there was going to be some form of repayment, but for a country where all of its major cities have been utterly shattered by as many as 300 drones a night landing in those city centres, the idea that you're going to give away all your strategic raw materials just so you can survive is what? Well, at the end, you're just going to be a load of territory with no resources, shattered buildings. How do the people rebuild? Who's going to rebuild that? And the whole notion of strategic humanitarianism, which was in the book, Putin's War, is completely ignored. How are we going to rebuild all of this? I mean, it's bad enough rebuilding German cities after the Second World War. The damage that's been imposed on Ukraine in this war is even greater. How do you rebuild all of this? And
well, presumably the argument would be that the investment in the minerals within Ukraine will find its way into rebuilding the infrastructure and the buildings in the shattered cities.
but it doesn't, does it?
Well, it
against
hasn't happened
America.
yet, so we don't know. But
Oh, let's assume it's oil and all the other good juices.
yeah,
But
exactly. Are we talking oil here ultimately? What are these
well, some people are
minerals?
saying oil, some people are saying graphite. I mean, they're all the things that will serve California quite well to keep the sun belt of chips and all sorts of things going. The problem is, though, that's only so we've only covered two parts of the problem. First of all, Putin is a megalomaniac with kind of no control over how much he's going to take back from the past to rebuild his version of the future. Now we've talked about new colonialism not being practiced just by Putin, but being practiced also now by Trump, because all Trump's doing is copying the Wagner Group. I mean, nothing different. The third thing that we have to discuss now is how do you get two countries to settle and come to some form of agreement when one has committed directly genocide on your country? That is such a stumbling block. I mean, we're in the same proportions of trying to come to a compromise between both sides in Palestine.
But
Because,
you're right. I mean, but added to that, the aggressor, Putin, the man, perpetrating these genocidal acts, he thinks that all of Ukraine should be part of Russia anyway.
well, he does, and that's why he'll never stop. And I don't believe the regime that's coming afterwards, after he's dead, passed or whatever, will stop.
No,
They're
we
going
always
to,
assume there's a nice, cuddly liberal government ready and waiting.
yeah. I've been
But
doing this too long to know that you don't get a cuddly government with the Russians. And
no, I think we just have to
and
look at history for that. But
you see, now there's one thing here that of all of this which we're all missing. One of the reasons why Putin has been going down this route is because during the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was suddenly occupied with people from places like Harvard and the Boston Management School, what have you, saying, we won the war, we're going to take your resources. Now, for those of us who have got longer memories, we know that the Russians weren't defeated in that war. The Soviet Union collapsed. There wasn't a big war that the Americans won. It's a bit like if you talk to American soldiers, the Vietnamese never defeated us, we left.
well, it was a Cold War, so
It was a Cold War, but there was no arms and nobody traded.
but
Now,
that's what you get with a Cold War, isn't it? So
yeah, and now you're trading arms. And imagine Putin's forces have weathered the NATO storm and they're still there and they're still winning. And in all of this, NATO has pushed all of this power and authority into Ukraine and has not blunted Putin's strategic initiative. He still holds the whip hand in strategy.
is this okay? So the Ukrainians do have a foothold into Russia. They've got the Kursk city of Kursk, haven't they? So
Yeah, it's still a long way from Moscow.
yes, of course. But does that
And
provide
it's
them
not
with
going
it?
anywhere. Where's it going?
Yeah, well, that's my question. Does that provide them with
It's
any
like
kind
what
of
happened. It's
any
like what
leverage
happened.
at all?
Well, it's like what happened with the Wagner Group in June 2023, when everyone was saying that was the end of it now, that Russia was going to collapse the next day. You had all these experts saying, well, that's the end of Russia. There's going to be internal rebellion. It's 1917 all over
Yeah,
again.
people got very overexcited
And
on
they
that
got all
journey up. Yeah.
excited. It was over in a week. And interestingly, me and the guys, we just carried on writing and we had a conversation in one session and I kept a record of it. And we all agreed this wasn't going anywhere. It was just not happening. And it was misreading by the experts. And I think that's again the problem that we have. Because as we're discussing this while Starmer's come back saying yes, he's going to have some form of agreement over Ukraine with Trump, and Macron's come back, and
Yes, in the newspapers are getting very excited by all this, which I'm a skeptical of. But
well, you
uh,
see, well, I dubbed a word for this, and it started in 2022 when Johnson was beating his chest, and I thought this reminds me of realpolitik, only it's plastic war. So I called it realkrieg, and I used it in the book. And it's amazing how many Western leaders beat their chests and have done nothing. And Starmer saying, "Oh, I'm going to put a brigade of guards or whatever on the Ukrainian border to fight the Russians." How'd you get them there?
Well, I don't think you have a if it's guards, they don't have the numbers anyway. But if it even
You
if
know what I mean?
yeah, if you include the whole of the British Army, you would, I think, only be able to deploy. And having spoken to a few military men, you'd only be able to deploy for 12, maybe 18 months at an absolute maximum. And you would have no resources, no troops to place anywhere else. So I think it's just a non-starter.
I don't know where to go with that. I mean, but that kind of level of chest beating has been going on for 4 years now. And nobody has taken out the leaders and made them look as stupid as they are. Okay, I called it Realkrieg, but I could just as easily have called them prats. I mean,
Okay, Philip,
yeah.
that basically means then we can maybe talk about what you think might happen because it's a pretty depressing picture you're painting here. And it sounds as though you can't really have peace talks with a genocidal dictator that Putin is. The current plans, no one has enough resources. The Americans aren't going to put in troops. So where do we go?
Well, this is the great concern I have because Trump represents the isolationism that the American people have wanted for a long time. And even if they do commit to war, just hypothetically for a second, it's not going to be anything more than the kind of level that they have committed to extracting themselves from Afghanistan. In other words, they're not going to expand their military forces. They would only use what they have. And given that all their stocks are down, they're having recruitment problems, that there's some units really in a bad way, the Americans are like the rest of the Western forces in NATO, not well off. And if you listen to some of the American generals who I've talked to and colonels, the American military is in a very bad situation. So, we say, well, what's going to happen to America? But the only thing America could have done was to continue to give credits to Ukraine. Well, if they're not going to do that, unless, Ukraine gives away the family silver, we've got to take America out of the equation. And Europe's got to decide, is Ukraine part of Europe? Now, in my country, and I'm talking about being in Germany, there's a significant portion of the population that voted against war. And a lot of people in Britain and America don't realize that fundamentally, Germany doesn't want to go to war. So the idea that the potential new chancellor, he's not chancellor yet, Merz, is going to lead Germany as the new powerhouse of a European army, a European force, I, for one, don't believe it.
No, neither do I. But they don't have the troops anyway, though, do they?
Well, they don't have the troops. Merkel allowed the German armed forces and the Bundeswehr to literally collapse into a worse condition than the British army. So,
Which is saying something.
so the Germans are down, the Brits are down, the Dutch are here or there, the Danes are prepared to fight but have only got a few troops. Finland are beefy. Sweden isn't very powerful. Italy's indifferent. Greece is losing its American troops. So what will happen there? And then there's Spain and France. Well, that is such a hodgepodge of.
Well, there's Poland as well.
I was going to come back to them in a minute. So that's the traditional powerhouse of NATO, and it's pretty much wasted. And Putin knows that. Okay. So then you've got the countries on the east. Now, if Ukraine falls, Romania and Hungary are totally exposed. Poland then becomes a target. Estonia and the Baltic states, okay, they're a concern. But if you look where Belarus is, Belarus has already, remember, had an engagement with Poland in 2021 when all those refugees were pushed into Białowieża forest. So there's already been troubles there. And the way the missiles are fired at Lviv and areas, they're aimed in such a way that they're irritating the Poles, with the sound of rockets going over. So you've already got confrontations along that border. Now, how do you get that long border, which will extend even further if Russia takes Ukraine? Then what? And this is why I go back to the European army concept. If you've got a European army, you can start looking at all of that as a concentrated action and allowing troops to get in and equipment move to the hotspots rather than just hoping, oh, well, we'll just send the British army off. We're back to some kind of, I don't know, strange period when all these armies are all going off to the Crusades. You need is a coordinated centre.
Philip,
And there's
even if you
no
got
active.
all the Europeans to agree, we're talking, everyone's defense spending, as it's all that's been in the news in the last few weeks. Everyone's defense spending so low, you wouldn't be able to produce a European army for another 5 years.
No, I think it's actually possible with all the joint ventures that have been put together that you could have a credible military force holding that line. And if you don't commit the Air Force and you put up the large screen of anti-aircraft and drone capability along that frontier, Europe could defend itself in the sense of being able to, how would you put it, have a leeway before the Russians, if the Russians are going to go for an attack. There would be time. There's still time. The Russians aren't coming tomorrow. You
No.
could start building now. The
I mean, that's the
question
other
is,
thing. The Russians, they're not going to want to fight on two fronts, are they? They will have manpower problems now. I mean,
if
with
they take
1.2 million
Ukraine,
casualties.
if they if they take Ukraine, you'll see a heightened level of hybrid warfare taking place across Europe, if not already. I mean, a lot of the violence that's taken place in some of the countries, I think, has been spurred on with Russian money. I think it's just what he does. Yeah. So what my impression is, you have to decide whether Ukraine is a European country. If Ukraine is a European country, then Europe has to go and defend it ASAP. If Ukraine isn't in Europe, then sadly you have to do what happened in Spain in 1938. You have to say, I'm sorry, can't do anything. That's a painful exercise. Because if NATO had intervened on day one and said there's a war exclusion zone going on here, there was a chance for NATO to hold off the Russians. But now the Russians have got stronger and they're getting stronger, and their military exercises, their military operations, and their industrial complex is building a coherent military force. And it's not to be missed, they have negated NATO power. They have blunted the technology. Now, you imagine some of those great big howitzers, self-propelled howitzers that came from Germany, some of those things take up to 18 months to build. So if you lose 10 of them and there's only 10 around, you've got to think about 2 years. So that's your lead times. So my view is now you have to decide, is Europe going to defend the new frontier, which effectively it would be with Ukraine, or does it go into Ukraine and defend, i.e. doing the Starmer thing? And I think we're into that kind of horrific moment of decision. And I don't think there's anybody who's got the courage to do it in Europe, to take the right decisions. And I know it's gloomy, but you can't imagine how much more gloomy it is when you've actually worked out the process and you've gone through and you've tried to game it and you've seen it progress and happen. I mean, that is just, it's soul destroying.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for giving your thoughts. Sadly, a dose of realism from you there. Well, thank you very much. And the links are in the show notes for listeners if you want to check out some interesting thinking on the war in Ukraine and Putin's genocide. So the title is Putin's War, but as I say, links in the show notes. And can I link you? Can I link listeners through to your writings that you mentioned your colleagues are continuing to do?
Yeah, we're Fallout at Ghost, which is this new web platform.
I'll link that in as well then.
With Elon Musk doing stuff in Twitter and the Substack people getting involved with Trump, there's been a move again to Ghost and platforms where there's no links with the American community.
Oh, right. Well, Aspects of History is on Substack. Does that mean we're aligned with Trump? We're not aligned with anyone. We're an independent. If listeners are getting spitting their tea out, we'll
you're getting the message out. You actually want to get it out to the message to people who
Yeah,
are on the wrong platforms. I try and say that to people, but you know, we're in an age when everybody wants to censor everybody else. So what can you do?
fair enough. Okay, thank you. Now for a brief chat with Tessa Dunlop on her new podcast, which blends politics with history, and she and I chatted the war in Ukraine. Tessa, great pleasure to have you back on. It's been a very long time, but you've been working hard on your new book. But it's great to have you on. And I wanted to speak to you, and listeners, this is a quick bonus with Tessa, because she's been very vocal on the news waves about the war in Ukraine. And coincidentally, Tessa will be appearing on a new podcast, which blends history with politics. And as we all know, we should be listening to historians a lot more, as we saw with the US
Yeah.
election coverage. You're itching to say something, so I'm going to keep quiet.
Yeah, no, I like it when you talk a lot. It keeps me down, as it were. I do have a tendency to prattle on, but I actually have, you're right, just been putting a book to bed, which has looked almost exclusively at the way in which we commemorate war. So I've become kind of quite engulfed in the impact of war, not just for the soldiers who are giving their lives today for our tomorrow, etc., but I think the impact of an individual death, as one mother of a fallen soldier in Afghanistan, he died in Aaron Lewis, he died in 2008, shot by the Taliban. As she said, every military death is like a stone landing in a pond, and the ripples go out, and impact so many people. And I can't help but think in that moment, it made me think of Ukraine and the deaths in Ukraine and the numbers of people who've fallen, and literally the sacrifice for their homeland, and the appalling way in which America has behaved as this unforgivable as an ally to behave like that. It's sort of reminiscent of, I'm trying to think of an equivalent. I mean, it's worse arguably than sort of Russia in 1917. At least they'd had a sort of revolution as an excuse for pulling out as an ally on the Eastern Front, although of course the impact of that turned over countries like Romania at the time. It's appalling. And then lines like Trump yesterday, I haven't slept, I don't know about you, but he comes out saying, oh, well, I don't know about NATO, because would they bother fighting for us, would they protect us, says Trump 24 hours ago. And I think the coalition of the willing
9/11
who joined them erroneously in many respects in Afghanistan. Will we list the countries? In Iraq, Ukrainians were serving alongside Americans in Iraq. And Vietnam, thank God we didn't join their coalition of the willing then, but there were plenty who did, to give them their sort of covering international gambit flags. It's absolutely extraordinary that we're allowing this to happen. And I think initially I thought that Starmer had been quite clever, the way in which he kind of trod the boards, bridging between the bureaucrats in Europe and America. But actually, I think we need to come down stronger and harder on America. Who the hell do they think they are, except for, of course, the greatest military superpower on earth?
Yes, well, I don't think that at the moment Britain has enough influence anywhere.
No, but United, actually, I mean, I have real reservations about the Polish leader, Tusk, but he's quite right to point out the United clout of Europe vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis America. And actually, I think the way in which we galvanized behind Ukraine, and I say we as in Europe galvanized behind Ukraine, was faster than certainly I think Putin imagined we would, and more effective. And I think that it is injudicious in the extreme of America not to recognize that Europe, when it gets its act together, isn't actually a write-off, but a force to be reckoned with. Look at Germany now, riding over their debt wall to make sure that they can arm up.
But I think that Trump is Trump. This is inevitable. He's going to say things that are incorrect, outrageous. And yes, you're right. We have
to. Not just saying them, Ollie. He's not just saying them. He's preventing vital intelligence getting to the Ukrainian front line. People are dying.
Yeah. He's completely withdrawn all
support
Trump from Ukraine. Yes, and that, of course, that's terrible. But it's not like we didn't know he was going to do this. He had basically been saying this, hadn't he, before the election?
Do we think that it would have happened so unilaterally, so unequivocally, and including intelligence, which implicates, by the way, the use of our shadow missiles?
In all other areas of Trump's presidency, he appears to have been carrying out plans made prior to him taking office. So he's sort of hit the ground running with the Doge and all this kind of stuff. This is, to me, he's just doing what he was planning to do.
I think one of the reasons we're naive about this is his first time in office in 2016. He didn't have a free rein in the administration. He came into the White House without his stooges. And you're right, this time, arguably, we should have been much more wise to it. We should have taken him literally, because he had got his sort of crazy rainbow crew in behind him, including Musk and Vance, well in advance. And it should have been clear to us. I mean, look who he appointed as health secretary, for goodness sake, and blooming anti-vaxxer Kennedy. So we should have been aware that this was going to be Trump point two, Trump bonkers Trump, as opposed to unpleasant Trump. But the implications are absolutely dire. And in the end, the only way that there can be a solution is for Europe to unite. And it fascinates me that, one of the great spectres we feared was a European army. Do you remember during the Brexit campaign?
Well, some of us
terrible fear of some of us feared this European army, but particularly on the right. And I see the likes of Kelvin Mackenzie now, who I've often locked horns with, who's a great Trump supporter, who was hugely anti staying in the EU, now absolutely devastated by what's happening in Ukraine and by the impact of this unforgivable American behavior. But why did you think you could risk it? Why did you think it was safe to vote in a loose cannon like Trump? And the idea, I think one of the great mistakes the British establishment made on the right is to think that Trump was made from the same material as them. And actually, there is some kind of silver lining here. I bumped into Mark Francois
A Spartan.
of the Conservative Party. But when I first met him, he actually introduced me to Helen Lewis, the mother of this Aaron Lewis from the British Army, who died serving in Afghanistan. And even last summer when I met him, he had his little Ukrainian little tie pin badge winking in the sunshine. And I met him a couple of nights ago in Millbank, bumped into him. And likewise, he's utterly devastated. And it is reassuring to know that our right-wing members of the Conservative Party are nothing like those in the Republican Party. And as I was explaining on my podcast with Ian Dale, that extreme Republican isolationist stance, which has historic precedents, is something that I don't think we understand. And we think Americans are like us, and they're not, actually.
No, FDR was a Democrat. So the podcast that you're going to be doing, are you going to be addressing, Ukraine's the major topic. Presumably you're going to provide Ian Dale, who is your co-host, with a historical backdrop. I find using historical examples quite reassuring in this kind of time.
Or potentially terrifying. Because
I find it reassuring.
The lack of historicity. Do you? I don't.
Yeah, I do. I think we're returning to normality, and I find that reassuring.
The idea that this is the kind of strongman era, so we're going back to the Devil's Decade. But it's not reassuring, Ollie, if you look at the devastation that World War II wreaked upon the world. How can you in any way suggest that thinking that we're going back to this strongman era, unfettered behavior, impunity, autarky, tariffs, is going to lead to some kind of benign rainbow style outcome? It's not. I'm terrified.
Maybe I'm using the wrong
Russia
time.
Or Germany.
Maybe I'm using the wrong time.
250,000 minimum. In fact, 380,000 British military personnel thought to have died in World War II.
Leaving aside World War II and World War One, maybe pre-1914.
I rest my case. And actually what's interesting is the peace that we've had since then. Okay, there's been disastrous sort of asymmetrical wars that America's led, and we've locked in behind them in the likes of Afghanistan and Iraq in the wake of 9/11. But the truth is, Ollie, since 1945, partly because of NATO, partly because of the threat of military might from mainly led, but not exclusively by America, we've had relative peace. And that's falling apart. And what Trump's doing, because he's ahistoric, because he has absolutely no clue, he doesn't understand that American wealth is built on the untrammeled access and credibility and trading routes he has with the great free and rich world. 25% tariffs with Canada, 70% of Canadian trade is with the US.
Yes, he's going to cause a global recession, and it's going to hit his own people. So he's just, I think, suspended his tariff attack on Canada for now, he says.
Some of the tariffs.
This is a lesson now for Europe to step up and, as you say, create this sort of Europe-wide defense.
Army.
Yeah, but I don't know that this will... Our leaders are too disunited. We are proposing to increase defense spending to is it 3% by the middle of next parliament? That's 10 years away. And that's a pathetic figure. I mean, we haven't spent much on defense since the Cold War, 40 years ago.
We are. I agree. It's dismal. Isolationism lasted in America for over 2 centuries. And when I'm saying isolationism, in World War One, the hard right of the Republican Party really appreciated and liked the way in which the hardline right-wing crazies in Germany operated. They respected the isolationists, Hitler's National Socialism. You know, we're talking about a different world, one that we don't recognize. We didn't start having these kind of bonkers, high precedent state visits from American presidents. By the way, our late Queen met 13 American presidents. We didn't start having them till 1919, because it was only when America came in 1917 in World War One that we recognized, oh, look, the emerging giant. We might just want to lean in to America as a proper and potential ally. And then it took them till 1941 and Pearl Harbor to actually fully wake up to their potential, to not just guide through the model of their democracy, but actually through helping back up imperiled sovereign states like Ukraine.
Yes, so this is all the more reason why Europe needs to massively increase its defense spending. You'd need 5%, don't you?
I'm finding myself kind of sympathizing with the likes of Kelvin Mackenzie and what he's saying. Like it's extraordinary. It's a bit like the pandemic when I was a bit anti-lockdown. I was like, what? But I think the upshot of it all is, we absolutely need to rethink where we're at, and lest we think that Trump isn't being just an unreliable ally to the likes of Ukraine. If you look at what's happening and the regimes he admires in Europe, and I think this is him trying to insidiously dismantle the EU, incidentally, because it's a threatening bloc, it's a much bigger bloc, trading bloc and economic bloc potentially than America is. The support that he's given to Hungary and the way in which they include Orban and all that kind of narrative and his stooge in America, and the outcry. And I'm going there next week actually with Radio 4. It's very insecure what's going to be happening in Romania as to whether they're going to re-elect a president who's pro-EU and pro-NATO. And again, America's interfered there, because at the Munich conference recently, Vance spoke out against the cancellation of their election and blamed EU interference. And I think the existential threat that America poses isn't just the withdrawal of their intelligence and their military in Europe, but the way in which they're capable of interfering with European elections. It's not just Russian interference we're now dealing with, it's actually American interference. And remember that I think, at a baseline, I think they're looking to destabilize Europe. I think the Trump administration are looking to destabilize. They actually see more of themselves in the anti-woke, ghastly, butchering autocrats in Putin's Russia than they do in fledgling democracies in Eastern Europe, which we should feel rightly proud of, incidentally.
Yes, well, the criticisms they make of Ukraine about it being undemocratic, a million times worse in Russia. So yeah, it's ridiculous accusations. Right. So look, I think we're running out of time for our little blast.
Is that a rant enough?
Tessa.
Was that too much ranting?
We barely, yeah, no, there's plenty of, I think everyone wants to rant at the moment, but we must think of the listeners. There's this new podcast coming out. What's going on with this?
I was thinking of the listeners.
Well, I always think of the listener.
It's Ian Dale and Tessa Dunlop on Global, and it's called Where Politics Meets History. And I'm going to be forefooting American isolationism and its historic roots way back to the founding fathers, George Washington speaking out against allying with old Europe and the old world. And of course, I mean, if you look at American geography, it lent to isolationism and the great emergence of America as the most wealthy nation on earth. But in living history, we've got used to a very different version of America. And I think what's extraordinary is they either seem to be hugely interventionist or massively isolationist, and there must be some space in the middle that we can encourage them to occupy. But I don't think that moderation is a word or middle ground are words that we would ever associate with Vance or Trump. So yeah, I'm scared for the next 4 years and beyond. Okay, well, that's another podcast for listeners to listen to. They're taking questions, aren't they, Tessa? We are taking questions. Absolutely. We've got a burner phone, actually. Yeah. We've got a burner phone. I will put that in the show notes for listeners. If you've got a burning desire to ask a question of Tessa, please. please.
I got mine
Yeah.
in, but I don't know if it qualifies, so I'll have to listen.
It was so long, I didn't really understand it, but we know that your intellect is
It was
greater than mine.
so
Oh, Ollie, am
long.
I allowed to say, Ollie, who's editor of a history magazine, might also become a fully fledged published historian. I believe there might be a little book deal in the offing there for you, Ollie. So we'll be sharing that, won't we,
Yes.
imminently? And perhaps I could interview you on your own podcast about your book in the future. That's something for everyone to look forward to. Well
That'd
done, you.
That'd be very exciting. All right, Tessa,
I'm
well,
very
thank you
proud
very
of you.
much for this. It's a very generous of you to give your Friday morning, and good luck with the new podcast.
Just finally on the list of the negotiation tactics and conditions that the Americans have laid down for Putin versus those they've laid down for Zelensky, their ally. So all the terms and conditions that Zelensky's having to fulfill, including the £500 billion rape of his own country by America, vis-a-vis exactly what condition on murdering Putin. Let's not forget the war crimes. But one of the women in my book is the sister of a Fox News reporter, Pierre, who was shot dead in Ukraine covering the war. Press written on his back. Shot dead. Illegally shot dead. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's everything. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do give a kind review if you can, and plenty more history is on the way. If you want to get in touch, send comments via Spotify or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.